Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, millions have been spent. But first, federal funding and advanced DNA testing have played a huge role in allowing law enforcement to build successful rape cases despite the passage of time. Here to tell us about it is Chief Assistant State Attorney Adair Newman, Fourth Circuit State Attorney's Office. Welcome back to the program, Adair.
Good morning.
So, just last week, your office announced an arrest in a cold case rape. Jason Blunt, a 52-year-old, been living in Orlando. He was arrested on a DNA match that dated back almost 20 years. Can you kind of tell us how that case came together and how it fits into just sort of the larger scheme of cold case rape prosecutions?
Yes, certainly that case was a cold case. It was what we kind of call a case by case profile match, where we have a known DNA profile and we know that particular individual, therefore, has been involved and been the perpetrator in multiple rapes. But in his case, we did not have any match in our CODIS system. So we had not identified who the perpetrator was, but we knew that there was an individual responsible for multiple rapes in the Jacksonville area, and with a similar modus operandi, or MO, as it's often referred to. And in his case, a lot of effort was put into identifying him, but ultimately he was identified when he was arrested out of county on a completely unrelated case, and that led to his DNA being put in CODIS and the match coming up now in 2025.
And you talk about his MO, this perpetrator or alleged
Mhm.
perpetrator. We should say he's just been charged, but um, ambushing women was kind of, his approach. He would attack someone who was jogging or someone who's leaving their apartment, and so there was this similar, way that these would happen. Obviously, you had connected multiple incidents
Mhm.
that were similar, and I think, sort of speaks to the role that DNA plays in terms of, I'm sure all of those instances were investigated. You'd made the connection, and yet
Yes.
nobody emerged as a suspect.
Yes. And a lot of times the DNA makes the connection, but in terms of ultimately coming to the resolution and finding a perpetrator, sometimes, as in Mr. Blunt's case, the DNA being put into CODIS did lead to us apprehending him. But a lot of times it's just good old fashioned detective work, looking at the details and the similarities, looking at the location, and then sort of eliminating people. But these lessons in these serial cases and in these cold cases, we have learned, especially since we started the Saki initiative. We've learned different ways to investigate the cases, different ways to come up with, you know, names of suspects and to ultimately solve the cases, and different ways to approach the prosecution of these cases.
And so we're using a few acronyms we should probably explain, but CODIS is the FBI's National Combined DNA Indexing System. And that's basically this database that almost all people arrested now for significant crimes, their
Yes.
DNA is entered into that
Yes,
system.
the DNA is entered both at the federal, local, and state level. In Florida, there's a specific statute that identifies who the qualifying offenders are and when their DNA is to be collected at arrest and conviction.
And that's a fairly significant felony level or
Felonies and certain convictions for certain
violent
misdemeanors.
misdemeanors or
Yes.
yeah. And so you mentioned SAKI, and that also is an acronym we should explain. It's the National Sexual Assault Kit Initiative.
Yes.
And explain what that is. I mean, that's sort of a funding mechanism to test rape kits. Is that right?
It's a funding mechanism, but it originated with some prosecutors from some other states that noticed when they went through their property storage rooms that there were all these um, sexual assault kits that had never even been sent for testing, that were just sitting in property storage rooms. So that started the initiative that then became a nationwide initiative to give funding to various states and agencies. In Jacksonville, we received the funding through the state attorney's office, but it has always been and continues to be a collaborative effort between us, the sheriff's office, local law enforcement, local community partners, and even a survivor who is local here to Jacksonville.
And so the Saki funds allowed this agency and agencies around the state of Florida to begin tackling this backlog. There was a significant backlog in Florida. as many as I think 13,000 untested kits at one time
I can't speak to Florida. Our total number in Duval that we ultimately certified was 1,748.
that were certified. Explain what that means.
That we went through the process of physically going through the property room and just evaluating each case and making sure each kit had not, in fact, ever been sent off for testing.
And so were all of the cases that you found, all of the kits, I should say, that you found, were all of those eligible for testing, or were some of them not sent off because either some elements of it had expired or the case itself was moot for some reason or another?
No, in Duval, every one of the specifically part of our approach that we were going to send everything, just because cases, the time limitation or statute limitation had expired, doesn't mean that the victims didn't deserve answers. So it was our approach to make sure that we got answers to victims, regardless of whether or not the prosecution was viable at the time.
And one thing that's interesting and meaningful about this DNA testing and these databases that are built is that it's not just about a successful prosecution in one case, because as we were talking about just a moment ago in the case of Jason Blunt, there can be multiple victims by a single offender. And sometimes, even if one case can't be solved, that can be a connective tissue to help solve another case.
Absolutely, and that is another important lesson we learned from the initiative was that a lot of these cases were sent off and say, in one instance, statute of limitation had expired, but it was a DNA profile that was related to multiple sexual assaults. We wanted to investigate all of those cases because if we found one that was within statute of limitations and we could go forward and charge on that case, then we could incorporate the other cases in under the Florida law, which it's referred to as Williams rule or similar acts evidence, in order to support and ultimately put forth evidence to prove the case in court.
And I want to talk a little bit about how things have changed, in part because of DNA and the cold case testing effort for victims. But I think that what you're mentioning is part of it, which is if a person is not able to have their own case prosecuted, but if their case is used as evidence in a Williams rule, a similar type offense, and it's introduced as evidence, that victim might have an opportunity, for example, to give a victim impact statement or in some way be able to express or testify about what happened to them, if
In
that's important to
in
them.
yes, in those cases, if we have Williams rule evidence, we will obviously file a notice to ask to include it in the trial. The judge makes a ruling, assuming the judge rules and finds that it is relevant to the case that is being charged, then that victim will come in and testify in court, as well as the DNA evidence associated with that victim.
So tell us, first of all, how many cases have been filed as a result of these, we kind of processing that backlog?
Mm. At this stage, there have been 35 prosecutions through the Saki initiative. We are at the end of our grant process. We started originally with just the 1,700 kits that we submitted and seeing which ones were coming back to CODIS hits. After that, we evolved on to looking at secondary evidence to see if we could solve cases with things other than just the kits. So in the cases where there were kits and maybe we didn't get any DNA results, then we started looking at clothing, cigarette butts, items that may have been discarded around the scene as we progressed through this. And then more recently, and obviously at the close, we are looking at the cases where we have not been able to identify the suspect, but we know there's this known DNA profile of a suspect and the different tools that are now available to solve those cases.
So talk a little bit. I mean, right now you're the chief assistant state attorney in the Fourth Circuit, but
Yes.
you spent many, many years kind of running the sex crimes unit. I'm not sure I remember the name of it,
Special Victims Unit.
special victims unit. And so you prosecuted a lot of these cases. And I'm curious if you can talk about how different it is to approach a victim
Hmm.
in a cold case as opposed to someone that is a victim of a recent crime. I imagine it must be in some ways very shocking to someone to have a prosecutor or an investigator contact them about a crime that's maybe 20 years in the past.
Yes. And I would like to say that through the process of this initiative, since it did start in 2014, we've learned a lot of valuable lessons. about how to approach individuals. A lot of times you have to remember that this has been 20, 30 years. Their lives have entirely changed. These may not, A, be things that they want to talk about anymore, or B, also be sensitive to the fact that, their life has changed. They're in a different place, different employment, different people in their lives that maybe they have not yet shared this information with. So we like to not make a phone call. We find that, to call someone out of the blue and you don't know who you're getting on the phone can lead to a lot of confusion and questions. So our approach ultimately became to try to locate the individuals and, if at all possible, to try to initially make an in person contact.
And so once you've made that in-person contact, I mean, what kinds of range of responses do people have? Or do you find that because of life's, the evolution of someone's life that they are adamantly opposed, for instance, to pursuing a prosecution? How do you handle that?
Yes, people have had all sorts of different reactions. Some people obviously were waiting for this call, for this contact, and had been waiting for an answer for years. Some people are very angry about, the fact that it was unable to be pursued or prosecuted initially. Um, we've actually had people who, when we initially contacted them, they were apprehensive, not cooperative. But then I can think of one particular example where an individual contacted us afterwards. They had had a change in life. They had had a child and had decided that it was very important to them now to make sure that the person was held accountable. So it really varies by the person, by the case, and the circumstances.
We've got a call from Mark on the South Side. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I was just kind of curious. I seem to recall, and I think your producer mentioned it was the Golden State murders, where a gentleman committed some murders, and I think it was his brother who put his DNA into 23andMe, Ancestry.com, one of those DNA things. And so I'm curious, are you able to take old DNA from a cold case, compare it to a database out there, and maybe you come across someone who's a first cousin or a sibling or something like that? I would think that would be a way to at least get you down a path towards the folks that committed these crimes.
That's a good question, Mark. This use of familial DNA or kind of, genealogical tracking of
Mhm.
somebody is relatively new. And I
Yeah.
I think that the Golden State Killer case probably was the first big case, at least, where that was used to solve a crime.
I am not actually certain if it was the first or not, but I can say that those methods that the caller is referring to, there are two different types. There's the familial um, genealogy, and then there's the genetic genealogy. The we use both in Florida. The familial genealogy would be looking at an STR sample and then comparing
And
that.
what is that?
STR is single tandem repeat. It's just a type of DNA.
Okay.
It would be looking at a type of DNA and comparing that to any known profiles in CODIS and seeing whether or not there's a first order relative match.
Hmm.
And that has certainly been used and has been used in success in Florida. The Calvin Dumas case that I believe you had inquired about is an example of that. What the caller is referring to, the genetic genealogy, that is a separate type where you use more of a public database system, and that is also available as well.
So you mentioned the Calvin Dumas case. That was an arrest from just about a year ago. That case was
Mhm.
solved. I want to take a listen, if we can, just to your boss, State Attorney Melissa Nelson, speaking at the time of that arrest.
Calvin Dumas is a dangerous serial rapist, and frankly, he's every woman's worst nightmare. In the 90s, he broke into women's homes in the Brentwood and Eastwood neighborhoods at night, held his victims at knife point, covered their faces, and raped them. He targeted single mothers. He told them if they made any noise or reported the crime to the police, he would kill them or kill their children.
So this arrest last year was the culmination of a long period of research. He had been an offender back
Mhm.
in the 70s,
Yes.
but that predated this database.
So collection, yeah, he was not in the CODIS database, so we were not able to locate him just by a simple search in the CODA database. But he was ultimately located by a familial search.
Yeah, and so his crimes were, again, dating way back, 95, 96, 98, um, and, similar MO as,
Hmm.
Ms. Nelson just described, but again, it wasn't until a kind of a more recent, offense
Hmm.
that was not a sexual assault, right? It was something else, but got him into the CODIS database.
He was located. He was found out by a familial search. So a decision was made to do a familial search
I
to
see.
see if he had a first order relative in the database, and that is how he was investigated and apprehended.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Chief Assistant State Attorney Adair Newman about prosecuting cold case rapes. If you'd like to join our conversation, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We have a call from a different Mark in St. Augustine. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm kind of wondering something. I mean, you hear in the news about these, backlogs of these rape kits, on and on and on. And I'm just wondering if, God forbid, something like this were to happen to somebody I know, uh, would it do any? How can we expedite that as just a private citizen? Do we call the sexual crimes unit every month and say, hey, what's going on with my case, or do we offer to pay for it ourselves, or what can we do to move this along, or is there anything we can do to move it along?
That's a good question, Mark. I mean, I do think the good news is that the statewide database has been cleared in Florida, the local database. No, there is no backlog.
There is no backlog. That was eliminated in 2019 when people were recognizing that this problem existed. And I would like to say the legislature also addressed the issue so that that backlog would not ever exist again. The kits are required to be submitted by law enforcement within 30 days, and the labs are required to produce a result within 120 days. In addition, the legislature has gone on and funded a project that allows for tracking so that the victims have an ability to go online and track the kits online and see where they're at and what the results are.
And it's probably worth just, an inflection point on why that tracking system is important because many of the people involved in these crimes over the years, many of the victims had no idea that their kit was not being tested, had never been sent to a lab, and also probably worth noting that it is not an uninvasive procedure. Collecting these tests can take as long as 6 hours for a victim of a crime like that. It can be extraordinarily re-traumatizing.
Yes.
And so that tracking system was created because it was going to finally allow people a way of knowing if, in fact, their DNA results had been, or their sex kit results had been sent off.
Yes, I think it was all part and parcel of the overall focus on being victim centered. Victim centered in our approach in terms of how we contact victims, in terms of how we interview victims, investigate cases, and make sure that they are apprised of the progress of and status of their case.
So some of the ways that these get solved are sort of roundabout, and I want to
Hmm.
ask you about a case that you were intimately involved in from 2015.
Yes.
This was a case that happened in Arlington off of Justina Road. Can you just sort of remind us of the parameters of that case? Because it was one that really, I think, shocked the community.
Yes, that particular case, when we were called out, the victim was originally unconscious, had been basically choked to unconsciousness. There were extensive injuries. She was only 8 years old. It was very difficult, very emotional for everyone involved because she was such a young child. The trauma, she had trauma to her genital area. She had other multiple injuries. A lot of those of us that came to the scene believed that she had basically been left for dead. But she survived. And it was a case that JSO put a tremendous amount of resources into. At the time, everywhere in the area was searched. Every sex offender in the area was contacted to see if we could get any leads to solve the case. but it went unsolved for a very long period of time.
And so this case was actually solved in 2020, I believe,
Hmm.
or 2021.
I believe it was 2020.
Okay. And the the perpetrator in this case was discovered because he'd committed a carjacking. He was convicted of a carjacking and was in Clay County when this DNA match was found.
Hmm.
So I do think it was surprising, though. We talked a little bit before the show about the fact that he too was a juvenile,
Hmm.
which I found kind of shocking in that discovery. He was just 14
Yes.
at the time that he committed this assault.
Hmm.
Um, but you said that in the world of the investigators and the prosecutors, there was sort of an expectation that it might be a young person.
Obviously, we spent a lot of time kind of roundtabling the case, coming up with different theories to try to solve the case. But one of the things that kind of always struck out to the investigators and myself, stood out, I apologize, was that, there were these children in the neighborhood and they were playing. And I think as adults, we always teach our children to be wary of a stranger adult coming into contact with them. But none of the children had any remarkable memory of an adult. So it did seem odd that, if it had been an adult who had come into the scenario, someone who would have alerted the children to have been, cautious or somehow apprehensive, but that was not the case.
And so the perpetrator in this case, Henry Williams, I'm not sure at what stage that case is at in terms of the prosecution, but I know that when the arrest was announced by your office and by the sheriff's office, that the detective, one of the lead detectives on that case, told me at that event that when he learned of the arrest, he sat in his car and he cried um, because it had been, this incredibly difficult case for so many who were involved. I was just wondering, kind of you personally, since you were also on scene that day, what it was like to learn that the case had been solved.
Um, yeah, it was pretty important, pretty emotional to learn that it had been solved after all those years and all that effort. I know which detective you're referring to, and I would say maybe on a monthly basis after the incident had occurred, we would speak and just try to talk about anything we could come up with to try to solve the case. It was one of those things that it was never gonna leave your memory, until it was solved.
Do you think I mean, you've obviously handled a lot of these cases.
Mhm.
Is there one that, in terms of its resolution, has been especially gratifying?
Mhm.
Is that the one, or are there others?
That is obviously an important case. I would say the original case from Saki, the first successful prosecution we had, that was of Victor Reed, was kind of a monumental, case for us in terms of showing us that, all the work we went into to get the funding and to start this project really was worthwhile. And also, very importantly, from that case, it was kind of similar to the other two that we were talking about. He was a serial rapist who found his victims in a same location, and would convince them to get in a vehicle with him, and then he would rape them and discard them when he was done. It was very horrific facts, but it also was one of the first cases where we started to see these cold cases and put them together, and the challenges, but also that we can be successful with them despite the challenges.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Chief Assistant State Attorney Adair Newman about prosecuting cold case sex crimes. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937 or via email at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. There are cases that are more difficult just because of the facts of the case, obviously, than
Hmm.
others. And, sometimes they're kind of known as messy cases because the victim may have a more complicated life. There may have been drugs or alcohol involved. The person may have had even a history of, working, being, sex trafficked, or in
Hmm.
some circumstance, um, where, yeah, I think historically, if someone was in, a sex worker, that perhaps the case would not be as aggressively investigated.
Hmm.
Um, So when it comes to prosecuting cases like that, how do you, deal with those those facts and kind of presenting a case when it's not perhaps just a, cut and dried sort of, stranger rape
Mhm.
in the I don't want to say the best circumstances, but something that is, more clear cut.
I think a lot of it has to do with kind of that education in the beginning of the prosecution, and something that we explained to the jury in the beginning. And what we have seen, and you're kind of sort of focusing on it, is that in a lot of these serial cases, the perpetrator does actually target vulnerable victims. Because there's that thought that A, they won't report, or B, if they do report, they won't be believed, or nothing will be done about it. So that was a huge lesson we learned from the initiative, especially when you have the advantage of looking back in time, and all at once you get, say, five hits for the same perpetrator, and you notice that they were all the same type of vulnerable victim, that he targeted in an effort to get away, and never get caught with the crime. So just kind of recognizing that from the beginning, knowing that that's something you need to explain, and then focusing on that. Despite that, here is this victim, and she is telling you what happened, and here is this DNA, and these injuries, and this evidence that supports what she's saying, all along.
And DNA, I guess, becomes even more kind of powerful in cases where there are perhaps, disputed circumstances where something happened. But
Yes.
it still can't overcome, I think, the traditional he said, she said. I mean, it's obviously that is not always the gender dynamic of a sexual assault, but,
Mhm.
this idea that this was a consensual act and DNA doesn't resolve that.
No, it doesn't. There's always, the defense always could put forth a defense of consent. But it's also where, when we have these multiple DNA hits and the Williams rule evidence that I was talking about, where it's more than one victim coming forward to say that this occurred, that really lends to our ability to be able to successfully prosecute a case.
Is there a statute of limitations on sexual assault?
Okay, so statute of limitations is probably the most complicated with sexual assaults. What one has to understand is the statute of limitations that applies is the statute of limitations that existed at the time of the crime. So to say whether or not there is a statute of limitations, one would have to go back and look to the year that it happened. I can tell you, just as a general statement, capital sexual battery does not have a statute of limitations.
And remind us what that is.
That would be a crime involving a child under the age of 12 and the perpetrator over the age of 18. And the legislature has, over the years, really expanded the statute of limitations as it relates to sexual assault. And I can say that one of the greatest tools they gave is, if the crime is reported within 72 hours, then that affects the statute of limitations. And as I said, they've really expanded it to allow for a lot more prosecutions than, say, back in 1982.
And so you say if it's reported within 72 hours, I know that there in some places, I think that in Florida as well, there's this option for people to, for instance, have a rape kit collected,
Hmm.
essentially report, but withhold, moving ahead with the case so that the
Yes.
evidence exists, but they may or may not decide if they want to go ahead for any number of reasons. Does that delay, if someone chooses to have the evidence collected but not necessarily make a decision immediately, does that impact that 72-hour, time frame in terms of reporting and therefore possibly impact the statute of limitations?
I know you are referring to a non-reporting case. Those generally get, if they come to us to be prosecuted, it would be that the victim chose to convert. I am not 100% certain on the answer to that question. I believe it's reporting to law enforcement.
Yeah. Overall, do you think that the system has gotten better about communicating with victims, how we treat victims, how we kind of think about, the way that what has happened to them impacts their testimony, impacts,
Mhm.
what is sometimes seen as their credibility. I mean, do you think that we've gotten better overall at sort of managing this kind of crime?
Yes. I think we have. I'd like to think that we definitely have learned some really important lessons, especially here in Duval County over the years. Um, it's been eye opening to have the ability to go back and look at the work that was, say, done in the 90s and see how an interview was done versus how it's done today. The sheriff's office has invested a lot of time and resources into training their detectives. I know they go to get a lot of education on trauma informed interviewing. One of the best examples I can say that we've seen over the years, it's really striking how much this stands out to me when you look back, a lot of times in the old reports, it would seem confusing or jumbled because of how they would write the victim statements. And one of the things we've learned is that chronology is one of the things that is greatly impacted by trauma.
Hmm.
So it would look like a confusing interview if you didn't know that a victim who's experienced trauma is going to jump around chronologically. And our detectives have kind of learned that. We record the interviews as well now so that, we can go back and really see the details and then kind of see where that chronology actually fits in.
Well, it is a lot of work that you do, an important work, Adair Newman. It is great having you here. Thanks so much for coming on to talk to us about it
Thank you
today.
so much.
All right. Up next, how the governor's vetoes take a bite out of the region's mental health network. Welcome back. The governor's veto pen stripped $20 million from Northeast Florida projects, including hundreds of thousands earmarked for minority, youth, and mental health programs. Here to discuss the potential impacts and the need for these services is therapist Nicole Davidson Harshaw. Nicole, welcome back.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. Good morning.
Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Suzanne Pickett. She's president and CEO of the historic Eastside Community Development Corporation. Good morning, Suzanne.
Good morning.
Suzanne, your agency is one that was targeted by these line item vetoes.
Yes.
The historic Eastside Community Development group was slated to get $200,000 for a wellness initiative. Can you, first of all, just describe what the program would have done?
So the program would have helped us in our community initiatives to help our residents and organizations identify the barriers from assisting the homeowners and residents from moving forward or accomplishing their goals in the community. And that includes our work in housing, our workforce, education, and arts and culture.
Yeah. And so the program is, designed to kind of address issues that keep people in the community from moving forward, but it has a focus on the impact of kind of systemic racism.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
do you feel that that's kind of one of the reasons that perhaps it got hit with the veto pen? We know that there's a lot of projects these days that, kind of have a DEI element that makes them more of a target.
Exactly. In our current political climate, unfortunately, we fear that may be the case because of the demographic that we're serving in the East Side and surrounding communities.
Yeah. And Nicole, talk a little bit about the mental health challenges that are in some ways unique to communities of color. Because, I mean, there's been a lot of research into just the stressors that attend life as a person of color
Right.
because of various disparities. Can you just sort of run us through what some of those issues are that have emerged?
Yeah. With minorities in general, there's the issue with navigating, inherent trauma. We were just talking about that, the fact that, a lot of issues that are traumatic that get passed down. They become patterns, they become those cycles. And those could look like trauma, anxiety, and depression down the road. However, on the onset, it could be insecurity with, housing instability, food insecurities, economic stress. When it comes to minority women, they're navigating, who they are in a society where they're decidedly supposed to be strong. And that's a pervasive stereotype that continues to perpetuate for a black woman. But the reality is they still are dealing with navigating sexism, racism, responsibilities in their roles as caregivers and anchors to the community, as well as trying to take that pain and push it down so they can be that strong person for not just themselves, but people around them. And so there's a stereotype to that. And then, two, between 2013 and 2019, and there was a doubling of suicide rates for Black girls from the ages of 15 to 24. So that's horrendous to hear that level of statistic. And so those things are still perpetuated in our society, that women are dealing with, that minorities are dealing with, and it really does become an issue when the resources are not there.
And one of the things that, Suzanne's program would provide for is care and services from people that look like the people who are seeking services.
Mhm.
I wonder if you can just explain, it is difficult, I think, sometimes for people of color to find someone to, be a therapist or someone that they could, talk to
Mhm.
that is also of color. There's just the numbers aren't there.
Yeah, the numbers aren't there. Um, you know, uh, we have 4% of psychologists in the United States that are Black. And that says a lot, while someone else of a different ethnicity and race would be able to be certified and, professional in providing that safe space for someone. There is something to be said for, Black individuals simply being more comfortable to talk and sit with someone and receive that level of support with mood disorders, with issues that they're going through, and they feel like there's more of an opportunity to be relatable and likely to understand. And that's no small thing.
Yeah. I mean, there is also, Suzanne, some historical distrust, mistrust
Right.
of the healthcare system for good reason. I mean, there has been, kind of historical baked in discrimination. There's been all kinds of, abuses, whether it's been research or just care.
Right. We talk about neglect as abuse in the East Side, and we talk about the fact that East Side has had no development for over 6 decades. And in my work, when I have these conversations with residents, and unfortunately, even younger students, they feel that there's no hope, that no one cares for them just because of the conditions that they're living in, or just because the caps or the barriers that are placed before them in attaining their goals. So it is very much a wellness issue, a mental health issue of identifying ways and services and methods to assist them, which is what this program would have done.
Can you explain a little bit more about how neglect of community can translate into um, a mental health issue?
So when you're a child, and I'll just speak from my own experience, when you're a child and you're walking through a community and your sidewalks are broken and there's broken glass, broken glass is, as I talk about one of the parks that I actually experienced from a child all the way into adulthood. Broken glass, broken sidewalks, dilapidated houses, your walk every day, your trail of trash, and just neglect. And regardless of who is responsible for that, whether it's your MSA, your city government, your community, that creates trauma, and that makes you think that no one cares for you when your environment is in such disarray in that way.
And Nicole, I mean, this is about, money and services that are available in some respects, but
Mhm.
also just maybe a different way of thinking about, what the needs are for individuals. Do you
Mhm.
have any kind of like big picture messages that, you try to communicate with people who might be reluctant to
Mhm.
seek care for a variety of reasons?
Yeah. The first thing I would say when someone's not sure what they might need is to listen to how they feel. Listen to your body. Listen to what you're noticing about yourself when you're in the room with other people. Um, I want to go back to in response to your question that being culturally competent to yourself allows for you to be available for what you do get to do.
What does it mean to be culturally competent? If you could just sort of break that down.
Yeah, so it's just a very real way of saying that if you are not feeling socially, economically, relationally available to other people in your social circles, in your family relations, then are you being competent enough to take yourself through your day, through your responsibilities and what needs to happen? Taking the time to recognize when you're not okay. Being strong is one thing, but there is no weakness and there is no excuse for having the vulnerability be something that you're not manifesting a different response to. It's okay to seek the support. And what happens in the communities of minorities is that support is not readily available. The resources are not there. And so what we really want to do is have those conversations about how to make mental health resources more accessible to individuals that are really wanting and seeking it. And when they don't seek it, learn how to seek it by educating our communities, educating what's going on, and not allowing those perpetual stereotypes to be strong, mean that you don't have to have the conversation with a mental health therapist. And DuPont counseling, I'm a DuPont counselor with JFCS. That's a bigger organization that we're a part of. And we have the resources and the wraparound ability for them to be able to have the support.
Suzanne, I'll just ask you what you're nodding along.
I just talk as she talked about, that opportunity or where the resources are not there to have these conversations and conversations that are relatable. A part of our Spaces initiative is getting back to collective care in community where we actually care for each other, where we're comfortable enough to come to each other and say we really need assistance, and comfortable enough to come together and identify resources collectively.
And just briefly, we should say that despite this veto, you plan to move ahead with this project?
Absolutely, yeah. We've applied. This is our second year applying for these funds that we still have not received, but we're still continually doing the work and looking for alternative methods to expanding this work because it's so important, especially as you see all the development, everything that's happening in and around downtown and the East Side. Allowing those residents to prosper, to be able to stay in place and prosper. And the mental health and wellness aspect is a very important part of that. I mean, it does not exist without housing, education, food, all of that is an important part of mental health.
All right. Well, we should say if you are in crisis or someone you know is, you can call 988. That is an emergency number for mental health assistance. But Suzanne Pickett, Nicole Davidson-Harshaw, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Right. Up next, we meet the public policy scholars selected for Jacksonville University's Nathaniel Glover Fellowship Program.
Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you. The Florida Star newspaper, serving communities for over 70 years, is dedicated to being your source for delivering thoughtful, factual news. The Florida Star is available at over 200 outlets in Florida and Georgia, or at floridastar.com.
You know what they say, the nose knows.
One of the key functions of the sense of smell is to be able to avoid things that made us sick.
Of the five senses, smell is often ignored by researchers, but it may be the most primal, the most beastly sense, and therefore the one that can tell us more about the world than we consciously understand. The Science of Smell on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
1 in 6 Americans regularly has headaches so severe they can't work, sleep, or function. Too often, patients live with the pain, and doctors and researchers overlook it. Why? And what's changing? Unraveling the mystery of migraine and cluster headaches, next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, it may be one of the most interesting and confusing times in the world of public policy, but it is also the driving passion of my two guests, both selected by Jacksonville University as the 2025 Master in Public Policy Nathaniel Glover Fellows. I'm joined now by Erica Christina Bartley and Sierra Campbell. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, for those who aren't familiar, we should probably just start out by saying, kind of what is the Nathaniel Fellowship, the Nathaniel Glover Fellowship program, named for our former sheriff, obviously.
Yeah, the Glover Fellowship is a program that was launched in 2018. And the purpose of the program was just to develop leaders here in Northeast Florida, but to develop leaders who had an orientation to public service. And so, in thinking about Dr. Nat Glover and his legacy, I see this fellowship not just as a schooling opportunity, but as a continuation of the legacy and the groundwork that he's laid here. And so they've developed a strong program model for their students, and I think the goal for the students and the alum is just to continue to walk in that path that he's laid here in Jacksonville.
Yeah, and you're from Jacksonville. You
I
are
am.
a proud Reigns grad.
I am.
But you have gone on to get an enormous amount of education, including a bachelor's of science in African American studies and education at FSU, and then you went to Johns Hopkins University, which you get your master's in education, and you've also taught a bunch. So you're going kind of back to school for this program?
Back to school again, I am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What about public policy appeals?
Just the fact that all of the systems that make up our quality of life deals with public policy. There is no area of life that public policy does not touch. And so to be able to influence, to be able to learn, and to be able to continue to impact is super important to me. And that's why I've decided to pursue this path at this point in my life.
Erica Christina, you're originally from Georgia, but you have
originally from Macon.
You're kind of dug in enough to be a native. You've been here for
I think so, 13 years. I think I'm on the native cusp.
Almost.
I'm almost there.
Yeah. So just what does it mean to you to be recognized in this way?
I think it's an honor to be recognized. I remember meeting Dr. Glover when I was a TFA core member at Matthew Gilbert. And
Teach for America.
Yeah, Teach for America. And he facilitated a workshop and taught us all about Jacksonville and his role in being a servant leader. And from then on, that just stuck with me. It stayed with me, and I wanted to be a part of that. So being named as a fellow for his namesake is an honor. Is something that, it's a great accomplishment because I do believe in that servant leadership.
And we should say, there are probably some people out there that don't know who Nat Glover is. He was the first Black sheriff in Florida since Reconstruction. He was the sheriff of Duval County. He also was the president of Edward Waters University, which was his alma mater. And he did something that was kind of remarkable after he retired, which is he took his pension and he created fellowships. He created scholarships, and he basically said he was going to dedicate his entire pension to the next generation and the next generation after
Giving
that.
back.
Yeah.
And that's that servant leadership, knowing that what you're doing and putting in the work, you may not see it, but I'm creating a pathway for those who will see it, who are after me. And that's very commendable.
And we should say, like your peer here, you have got a lot of education under your belt. You went to Savannah State University, Wesleyan College, Columbia University. You, in addition to Teach for America, you've been a principal and an instructional coach. And so this is a little bit of a change for you as well.
Yeah, it is. But it's not really a change. In those roles, you see how policy affects the individuals in which you serve. And you see how those decisions really impact students, families, communities. And so having that opportunity to having a seat at the table and being included on those decisions is something very powerful because you have to navigate. I've seen how budget changes affect families. I've seen how just simple changes with school lunches affects families, affects neighborhoods.
Which that is a public policy
That is
matter,
a huge,
right?
that's a public a matter that you see every day. Something as simple as supplies in the classroom, teacher lead money, those things have that effect. But being able to be at the table to help influence those decisions
is something that I want to do, something that this fellowship will give me the opportunity to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll tell you this, and just thinking about my experience in the classroom, I can echo the sentiments of Erica here, but I had to make the decision for myself that my impact and my influence would not start and end in the classroom. I had to take it to the policy table. I
Mhm.
could not leave it there in the classroom.
Because you saw you're making changes with the students, but you wanna have it, be a broader impact.
Exactly, exactly. Because when you see the systems like housing, transportation, public safety impacting our students on the outside of the classroom, and it impacts them, coming inside the classroom. So I wanted to not, let my impact stay there. While I was doing very meaningful work, I wanted to go outside of the classroom and get to the policy table.
Well, we are, lucky to have you both here in town, and congrats again, Erica, Christina Bartley, Sierra Campbell. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
All right, and thanks for listening. That's our show. The executive producer of First Coast Connect is David Luckin. Our show is produced by Stacey Bennett and directed by Brady Corum. Our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas, and our interns are Jessica Lee, Lo Oliveri, and Camille Crawford. Join us tomorrow when we ask two constitutional lawyers about recent Supreme Court decisions from mass firings to Florida's immigration law. I'm Ann Schindler.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Don't Miss a Beat presents The Lion King Jr., the conclusion of their 6-week Broadway Experience summer program. Performances will be held at the Ritz Theater July 24th and 26th. Information at don'tmissabeat.org.